Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today to discuss the top 5 security concerns when selecting a vendor. And now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our Chief Information Security Officer at the National Student Clearinghouse, John Ramsey.
Thank you for having me. Good afternoon, everybody. It's an honor to provide these presentations that I've done in the past few weeks. Today's presentation is really touching on the top 5 security concerns when selecting a vendor. Many organizations have vendor management programs that address a lot of this, but a lot of the organizations don't. So my goal today is just to highlight some key areas while you're working on selecting partners or even your existing partners. There's some probably key questions you should ask in order to be comfortable with how people are securing your data. For those of you that don't know about us, the National Student Clearinghouse, I won't read all the bullets, but those are the stats. We partner with many of you. When we go over these top 5 security concerns when selecting a vendor, you should be just as diligent with us if we're one of your vendor providers, just as you would with anybody else. At the end of the day, we interact with millions of PII records. The security of learner data, student data, it's not only important to you, it's important to us. We know it's stressful to make sure it's secure, especially when it leaves your hand and it goes into a vendor's hands or a partner's hands. There's a level of trust that needs to happen. Hopefully, at the end of this, you'll have some key areas that you can ask in order to gain that level of trust with whoever provides these types of services to you. We're helping you to understand how to gain that confidence. Some of the business lines that we service. And going into the heart of the matter here is why does this really matter? Third-party vendors, the reality is there is significant potential risk to your institution's data and the security of that data. Most organizations don't have visibility into how vendors protect that data. For many, it's a blind trust. We're going to discuss how it doesn't have to be a blind trust situation. At the end of the day, it's your data and you're ultimately responsible for protecting your data. And I'm going to go through a common theme here about asking the hard questions. Feel comfortable asking the hard questions. And a good example of potential third-party vulnerabilities, a lot of companies have contracts that use the various transcript ordering services, which makes sense. There's areas that you want to alleviate the burden of what you're having to do. With that said, going back to why does this matter? The Ponemon Institute identified in the survey that they did back in 2018, and it's the latest one that they have, really about data risk in the third-party ecosystem. Translated, how is data secured in these third-party vendors? And the bullets here are pretty interesting. The first bullet is that 56% of responders that they had in the survey confirmed that their organizations experienced a data breach caused by one of their vendors. 57% of the responders said they're unable to determine if the vendor safeguards and security policies are sufficient to prevent a data breach. Now that's pretty alarming. And the alarming part is, one, there's other surveys that are out there. The Verizon Data Breach Investigations report that comes out every year that shows misconfigurations account for about a third of all data breaches that occur. So the fact that half of these respondents were breached because their vendors were breached and it was out of their control, that is hard for something for them to be diligent about. And then more importantly, half of them have that blind trust situation that they're not sure if their data is even being secured with the vendors. From a malicious actor's perspective, they take the path of least resistance. You might have the strongest security posture out there. You might have the Fort Knox of security. I'm not going to waste my time to try to compromise your security. I'm going to go after a vendor that supports you that might have a lot of weaker security controls in place. The Department of Defense got breached in 2007, 2008. They didn't get directly breached. It was their third-party RSA that got breached that then compromised DoD. In December of 2020, there's a company out there, a third-party monitoring tool that sits on different companies' networks called SolarWinds. These organizations didn't get breached. The malicious actors breached SolarWinds product and then breached the organization through that access. And again, it happened in 2021. So why does this matter? Vendor security is important to you, to everybody, for the security of your data and how that plays out. So the title of the presentation is about the 5 top concerns you should have. And the first concern you should have is before you engage in this relationship, there's probably some key questions you should ask before you actually become a partner. And back to that common theme, ask the hard questions. Be comfortable asking them. You know, it's your data. You've got every right. If you were buying a car, you'd have no problems asking all the hard questions. Same thing here. And the first question you should ask whoever you're potentially partnering with, do you have a formal security program that's authorized by your company? You know, that's pretty critical. If they don't have a formal program, you know, how serious do they take security? Ask them, how large is the security team? Do they even have a dedicated security team? Do they have a dedicated budget to security? Do they have a chief information security officer or some sort of senior security official? If they answer no to those questions, they probably don't take security as a priority within their organization. Prior to the clearinghouse, I was assistant with the U.S. House of Representatives, and we had a vendor that came in, and there's members of Congress that wish to use those services. It was quite the conversation because I asked the exact same question of this vendor. Do you have a formal security program? And they said, well, no, not really. I mean, we keep stuff secure if we have to do stuff. If we want to make sure that we do stuff, we just buy the stuff. How large is your security team? We've got one person. I do it. Oh, okay. You know, do you have a dedicated budget to security? Well, you know what? When we need the money, we just get it and buy it. You know, so every red flag occurred at that point in time, and that wasn't the right partnership for us at that time. And again, the benefit here, it shows how serious the company, the vendor takes security and how they protect your data. Another question you should ask, how is your security program validated? Is it sufficient to protect sensitive data? If your program was validated, was it an independent assessment of some sort? What did it reveal? Was there any issues identified? How are you resolving these issues? You know, these are really key questions that if they've got the formal program in place, most companies that take security serious are paying a lot of money to make sure that somebody comes in and validates that their program is actually an effective program. And if you really want to make the vendor nervous, ask them if they've had penetration tests. Now, penetration tests is a service that a company will outsource and ask these groups of people to try to hack into their systems to see if they can actually be penetrated and compromise their data. Ask the vendor if they had a penetration test, what was the most critical item revealed during the pen test? For those that take security serious, they'll let you know because they also know that they're working to improve it fairly quickly. Another question to ask before you partner with anybody, does your organization use multi-factor authentication? You know, this wasn't a common question asked 5 years ago. It should be a common question asked now. 80% of all breaches occur because of compromised credentials. And the countermeasure to stop compromised credentials is MFA. So if an organization is using MFA throughout their institution, they're probably doing a pretty good job at stopping the bad guy and allowing compromised credentials to exfiltrate data. If they're not using MFA, what else aren't they doing that's the best practice? And that should probably generate some alarms when you're having that conversation. And a few more questions to ask before you partner. Patching. Patching is really cybersecurity 101. Ask the vendor, how often do they patch their appliances, their servers, their endpoints? The best practice is typically 7 to 15 days for a critical vulnerability, 30 days to be resolved for a high, and 60 days for a medium. If they don't have an established timeline, that's probably a red flag that they don't have a mature security program. And you'll want to take that into consideration if you wish to partner with them or not. Another question to ask, you know, if your organization's devices are hosted within our institution, who's responsible for patching and ensuring patches are kept up to date? And this is pretty important because the lack of patchings, the lack of a security patch is often compromised or exploited by malicious actors. It's usually the first way in for anybody to compromise a system. If you're hosting your vendor's product, whether it's an appliance or a software application, make sure you understand, is your IT department keeping that patched and up to date? Is the vendor keeping that patched up to date? Somebody needs to be patching it and keeping it secured. Make sure that that doesn't fall through the cracks because of a misunderstanding. And that really makes sure that you're making sure who's responsible for that. And then the last bullet there, incident response plans. Does your organization, does the vendor have an incident response plan in place? Every company should plan that they're going to be breached. I've done this long enough now. I've been involved with about 8 to 10 actual incident responses. It happens. It's only a matter of time. And how you respond and understanding roles and responsibilities before the breach occurs makes it so much easier to resolve a situation such as that. Now, the big thing is, if it's a cloud service that's being provided to you, typically all the company will do is provide you notification, and they understand how to cut off the access to make sure that their exploit doesn't occur into your organization. If you're hosting their software or one of their appliances, the key question you should ask is, if your appliance or software gets breached and we're hosting it, who resolves the incident? Is that the vendor, or is that your IT department, or is that your office? That's a key question to make sure that you understand who's taking care of that if you're hosting it internally. So that was really the first concern, asking those hard questions before you actually do anything with the vendor. Now you've asked the hard questions, you like what you hear, your comfort levels are getting a little bit stronger, and you want to move forward with the partnership. So keep in mind, there's no such thing as perfect protection, but it's up to you. It's the security of your data that you want to make sure some basic cyber hygiene is in place, which is going to help protect your data in the long run. So the next concern you should be asking and conducting is making sure that there's strong contract language in place between your company, your institution, and the vendor. You know, at this point, you ask the hard questions, the company answered them, let them own up to what they say they do, but in writing. And some advice on strong contract language. You know, this typically consists of 2 to 3 pages of realistic requirements based on the level of data sensitivity. So if you're asking somebody to come in and secure your student data, social security numbers, you're going to have stronger requirements than, you know what, we're just anonymizing these names and we're doing email through publicly known addresses. So, but either way, even with the most critical data sensitivity that you might have, 2 to 3 pages of realistic requirements is typically the norm. Don't overkill the requirements, because there's a good chance they can't do everything based on different regulations that the vendor has to follow, or legislation for other customers that they have to fulfill as well. And a good example is, and I see this often, don't indicate the vendor has to fulfill all your institution's security policies. Keep in mind, your institution's security policies were drafted for your institution. Logically, it's probably they're not able to fulfill these. Often there's stricter security requirements that these cloud service providers have, or the vendors have, because they're specifically tailored to their products themselves that they're providing. Plus, you might unintentionally ask them to reduce their posture by fulfilling your requirements, because everything's not apples to apples when you're looking at security. And then looking at the actual clauses in your contract, some key areas that you should have, and definitely partner with your legal offices, but key security related clauses include a best practice that should be identified, such as the National Institute of Standards and Technologies or the International Standard Organization. You know, these are best practices that companies should strive to achieve with their security programs, or the Graham-Leach-Bliley Act. You know, these are universal standards and they're doable. And more often than not, they'll meet all of your security requirements of your internal security policies. The contract language should also indicate, you know, that the vendor has a funded formal security program. You already asked a question, let them commit to this in writing as well. And formal means that there's an approval of the program at a higher level than the actual senior security official. You know, and this is common, just checks and balances, separation of duties. Cashier can't write and cash the check. Same with the program. You can't draft and approve your own program. There should be some sort of oversight. Include patch response times and best practices. This is a major attack vector that's often exploited. You ask the question, again, have them commit to something that's reasonable in writing that makes sense for the data that they're protecting. Include formal incident response plans as requirements that address data breaches and how they contact you if there is a breach, and what your responsibility is and what their responsibility is. This is pretty critical because you don't want to have to guess this when it happens. Going into the last item there, require third parties to notify you when they share your data with any other organization. And this is key because third parties also use third parties to do some of their business. You have a right to know exactly where your data is and who touches it and why. And the benefits to you with the strong contract language: one, you're transferring some of the security risk to the third party, but you're doing it in writing and through a contractual agreement. And it shows due diligence on your part to protect the student data, learner data, when it leaves your organization. Going into the next section here, independent audits, such as the SOC 2 or PCI. Up until this point, the vendor has talked the talk. Now the real question is, do they walk the walk? And this is what the independent audit does. Two examples are a SOC and PCI. I'll talk about these in a second. If they're confident in their security posture and serious about security, this is a given requirement. This is essentially proof that they not only have a program in place, but they have an effective program in place. The example I like to use, and I think it's a Geico commercial. The doctor goes in and sees a patient in the hospital, and this is a pre-surgery appointment. The patient asks if everything's going to be okay. The doctor answers, well, it should be okay. This is an example when you don't want to hear should. You want to know that they have a valid program in place. And an easy way to test this and ask, require them to send you a copy of that assessment before signing a service contract and every year before renewing. This is a common practice. Nobody's going to balk at this that has a strong security program in place. Make sure the audits are conducted by external, independent, certified auditors. You don't want something that they assess themselves. It's never as thorough or unbiased. The payment card industry, PCI, does the audits for credit card information, if that's what your vendor is processing for you. The SOC 2 Type 2 is an extensive audit that reviews hundreds of security controls, and it usually takes about 3 to 4 months to go through the full audit itself. And the SOC 2 compliance is part of the American Institute of the Certified Public Accountants, CPAs, Service Organizational Control Reporting Platform. So these are certified CPAs that come in and has a full check and balance of every control that you should have. They have peer reviews, quality assurance conducted at the end before their report gets issued. So it's a fairly strong report that whatever they say is truly reflective of what the program is. As for penetration test, they might not provide the full penetration test because of some of the vulnerabilities identified. Companies will often provide the high-level summary on what the penetration test was, what it was conducted on, and their actions that they're going to respond to as part of that. And this really goes into trust but verify. It's not only about talking the talk, but it's about showing that they can walk the walk. And the benefit to you, again, it shows diligence on your part before you're allowing your student and learner data to leave your organization. And more importantly, you're going to hear items that's going to build your confidence that you're selecting the correct partner that's going to keep your data secure. And going into the next check here, and this is the second to last, review external scan results. So every mature company or every company that has a mature cybersecurity program in place is doing some sort of external scans of their perimeter that's publicly accessible. On a good month, our organization probably has 200,000 to 300,000 penetration attempts that we're stopping. And we're stopping through a whole means of security tools that are out there, but some of that also is just what's publicly accessible and identified. I'm going to show you an example here, but there's a lot of ways to review external scan results. The easiest way is just to ask the company, hey, can we see what your external scans are and how you were assessed against that? And typically they'll provide some sort of report that shows, you know what, we have an A with our outside perimeter, we're doing pretty good. Or they might show that we have a D or an F. And if they show they have a D or an F, there's a good chance that's replicated across a lot of their devices, and they probably have some very ill-designed, poor designed processes in place to keep their stuff secure. Reasonable expectations are to see A's and B's. Now, a vendor can provide this to you, or there's free tools out there such as SSL Labs and Wormly. And I'm going to show you SSL Labs real quickly here. You can go to a site such as SSL Labs, When you go to the site, you click on Test Your Server. When you test your server, you'll be prompted to put in a URL. When you put in the URL, it'll come back with the scan, and it'll show you what your grades are. And I put in www.studentclearinghouse.org earlier. Our external perimeter, we score A+. And then if we wished, we could go into extreme depth of everything that was checked. Now, granted, there are hundreds of security controls that are out there. This does not reflect all 100 controls, but this reflects how a company keeps their perimeter secured to a degree. And usually if they've got a fairly strong score here, most of their stuff will be fairly strong across the board. The benefit to you, this is your data. If you start to see D's and F's on these external scan results, don't ignore the warning signs. There's probably something bigger at play. And then going into the last area, the last concern you should ask, understand the connection. You've done everything, you've done the checks, everything looks fine. This is the company you wish to partner with. Understand how they get your data and they process your data. And typically it's one of three ways. It's either cloud-based, on-premise, or a combination hybrid. Cloud-based means your data is typically passed to their cloud environment, and within their cloud environment, they process the data and do whatever actions that you've serviced them to do. The benefit of the cloud-based is it's usually easier to secure and patch. It's centralized for all the services, and the company doesn't have to worry about missing a patch. Usually they're only patching one device that provides security for thousands of people. You've got the on-premise potential, and the on-premise means you now have devices that are in your environment. You have to make sure that you understand, is your IT department or is the vendor patching this device? If the vendor's patching this device, they're not only patching your device, but they're patching the devices of all of their customers. And it's kind of a reverse approach. So you need to make sure that your device doesn't get missed as they patch all of their customers' devices or whatever that relationship directs. And regardless of the connection type, cloud-based or on-premise, make sure there's a routine patching cycle and it actually gets patched. And that happens a lot too. There might be a patching cycle, but your device gets skipped. And this is really critical to the safety of learner and student data. And then also going into the connection, regardless of the connection, make sure that you understand, can they access your data or change configurations to access your data? And make sure you understand, and if you're okay with that or not. And does your contract reflect their responsibility if their access gets compromised? And the example I like to use, a few years ago, the press announced that Capital One had a data breach. It was a fairly large breach. I want to say it happened in 2018. And some of the issues was that Capital One had a firewall. The firewall had an administrative account on that firewall that also had access to customer data. And long story short, the firewall account was compromised. That then led to exfiltrating the customer data itself. There's many more details than that, but to hone in, you need to understand what is able to access your learner and student data, and is that access safeguarded. And then if you use third-party hardware or software behind your firewall, ensure you understand or are satisfied with how that third party validates the security of their product and how often they identify and fix security flaws with their products. And the same with the cloud-based vendors that are out there too. Make sure you understand, how do they make sure that they're patching and keeping their stuff secured. And that is the bulk of the conversation. Going into the last slide, a quick recap of the top 5 security concerns. Ask the hard questions before you partner. You have a right to ask those questions. If the vendor's uncomfortable answering them, there's probably a bigger issue out there. Include the strong, appropriate contract language. They answered your questions, time to put it in writing. The independent audits validates that their program is actually effective to secure your data. The external scans gives you immediate visibility into what some of their security processes are. But lastly, there, understand the connection and who can access your data. That last one's really for you. You've got to be comfortable with how their service accesses your data and it passes a common sense test. If not, find somebody that's going to provide you that level of comfort. I mean, you really deserve a partner that makes you feel safe. Don't settle. Make sure you get the best of breed, because the digital lives of students and learners and everybody out there. And I am an open book if at any time you wish to ask any questions about anything that the clearinghouse does for you. And that concludes the presentation. Thank you.